Efrem Reis. Um, I am the assistant director at the Hebrew Free Burial Association. I'm a graduate of JTS. I graduated along with Rabbi Foster. Last time we talked about the things that happen the moment up to death, and I left it at that point. Now we are going to go into what I would call Zman Aninut, the time between death and burial. And there are pieces that are important for both the person who has died and as well as the mourners as well. So I also want to point out that there were two questions asked. They're really going to be talked in session 3. There was one about matzevot, about the stones. I'll bring that up in session 3 because that will be more about funeral. And we will also talk about green burial when we're talking about burials in general. This is really going to be about that in-between moment that often happens so quickly people don't understand what goes on, and also there's a lot of secrecy that actually goes around this piece of burial, and we can talk a little bit about why. But first, let me share my my sheet here. And now you're going to be able to see my big sheet over there. I'm going to just change the screen so I can see all of you people as well, so I can see everybody. And if they have questions, you guys can press the raise or anything like that. So let me get through some really key terms here. Aninut. So in the terms for mourners, there is being an avel, being a mourner, and there's aninut, which is the term for the time before being a mourner. It's that halachic state, that legal state, from the time that your loved one has died until burial. And you actually have different rules that are around there. And those people who are obligated in the rules of aninut are referred to as krovim, the immediate family. So this, I want to be very clear, is not to say you have to, you can't mourn for someone who isn't in this group, but these are the people that you're obligated to mourn for. Those are parents, children, siblings, and a spouse. Those 4 categories, those are the people that you mourn for. Then there's going to be this term that I'm going to use is called tahara, which is the purification of a body. When someone dies, that's that process that we undergo in Judaism. And one of the things is we put on tachrichim, which I'll show you. I have them actually over here. I'll show you some tachrichim so you can actually see what they look like. It's one of the, I don't know if I'd call it the perks of the job, but I have availability to do a lot of tachrichim in my role. And so you can actually see what burial shrouds look like. I happen to have taken out a men's burial shrouds. We'll talk about how they're men and women's burial shrouds. The next term is a chevra kadisha. It's really one of the first things that a community is really supposed to build. It's a community of people in the Jewish community who are committed to making sure that the deceased person is cared for. They receive the tahara, and that they get it in this proper way, and it's been taken care of. Maybe I'll throw in here, just because I didn't even talk about it, a shomer. We can talk a little bit about a shomer. I didn't even mention it, but a shomer, there's often accustomed to have a guard for that person. That's what shomer literally means, but really someone, not typing it correctly. Sorry. I am not spelling correctly. A shomer.
There's only so many permutations of those 5 letters.
I know. I'm like, what's going on here? It doesn't matter. A shomer is a person who sits with the body from the time of death until the time of burial. So that's what a shomer does. And then finally is kriya, which really we do right before the funeral, the burial begins, but is really part of this whole piece too. You technically do it as a onen, as a person who is between death and burial. So let's talk about the importance of burial. It's actually gotten us sometimes into trouble in history. If you want to do a historical, little bit of a historical dive, but I'm going to give you a little law that happens in Sanhedrin. Sanhedrin is the ancient court about the rules of the Sanhedrin. and they're actually talking about a person who was convicted of murder, right? And they say that if he's been hung, he's only allowed to hang for a very short time, and then we untie him. And if he's left overnight, a prohibition has been transgressed. The Sanhedrin has done something wrong, because there's a teaching in the Torah that says his body shall not remain all night upon a tree, but he shall bury him for that on that day. For he that is hung is a curse to God. So this is what I'm going to give you as a kal vachomer. There are many times they talk about this idea that burial should happen within a day, and in fact, if you go to Israel, burial will even happen in the evening. It's not really custom in America, but in Israel, if someone dies in a day, they will bury at night because they are very strict about the idea that you shouldn't wait for burial. Um, and there's some exceptions to it, but I can tell you, we were having an argument with a family this week where someone was dying, and the next of kin was a great niece, and the great niece insisted the burial shouldn't happen until next week. Fought us for it. And we try to really discourage that, because it's not considered respectful to let a body wait that long. And it's actually sometimes a piece that is in contrast to the world around us. There are many people in many other cultures where the idea is in fact to have, like in the Christian world, have a wake, or have things that where the body is on view for a while. We're not going to have that on view piece. We're not going to have the embalming in our tradition, because, and we'll talk about this more when we compare burial to green burial, from our conversation that we had. We're looking to allow a body to return to the earth, and preservation of that body as a physical thing is not something we're gonna look for. And also, it's in our tradition disrespectful to wait a long time for burial. Now there are definitely exceptions, right? Um, if someone is being flown to Israel, it's going to take a few days for that to happen. If there's a family member, we're taught if a family member needs to come from California, a day is a different case than, again, a week. I think that becomes a little bit more of a longer time piece in our world. But it was not uncommon in the ancient world for people not to be able to make the burial in the pre-airplane mass transit world, and you would then start a funeral. You would start sitting shiva, which we'll get to session 4, from the moment of hearing about the death. I had a congregant when I was in Florida whose mother passed away in Peru. He was not able to go down to Peru. He didn't have the money to go to Peru. Um, and he heard from his sister that the funeral had started, and she was turning off her phone for the funeral, and that's when we began shiva for him. And that sometimes happens. We have this case all the time where a funeral will happen, and the person will be buried in Israel, and only one family member will continue on to do the burial in Israel. And the shivas will be different for the family member who went to Israel with the body, as well as to the rest of the community, the rest of the family. The people who are back in America, the second the funeral ends and that family member goes off on the plane with the body, the second that flight has taken off, they're in shiva. They've moved on from that point. It's not from the time of the burial in Israel. It's they were not able to make it, so they start shiva on that day. And that loved one who is in Israel, who's going to be there for the burial, is going to start shiva on the next day. And that happens sometimes. So there is a very important piece to doing this as quickly as possible. Again, in those longer traditions, just so you have some interesting facts on this, the reason why flowers became a popular custom in the Christian world, but not necessarily in the Jewish world, is because the smell. Wow. If you're going to wait a long time for burial, it's going to be unpleasant in smell. I actually was talking to my friend who's a funeral director, and he mentioned that he just got a new car that has leather because it's easier to clean up the smell than cloth. And so he had to think about that when he's doing that. Unfortunately, when bodies start decaying, they start decaying, and it's not a pleasant smell. And so in times of antiquity, before modern embalming, the bodies would start to smell and they would be waiting a while. And it was a custom. In fact, there were some kind of blood libels against the Jewish community that we were burying too quickly in the medieval time. That maybe we were burying people while they were still alive. That's not the case. That people, people of the medieval world didn't understand that you can't, once you stop breathing, you're not going to start breathing again unless there's mouth to mouth or something like that. But they understood that as a mindset, and they were like these Jews. They're killing off people by burying them alive. And that did happen in the medieval times because we were quick to bury because of these rules. Sheila, I see. So you had a hand raised.
Yeah, there's another case, and that is if you die overseas,
Yeah.
then they hold it up, and it could be a week or two sometimes.
Yeah, things can get held up.
I mean,
Also,
when I'm saying you're basically when you die overseas in an accident, in other words, you are a citizen here, and you're sitting. It's always strange to say, "Oh, I have a funeral in 2 weeks," and if it's a Jewish funeral, they say, "What do you mean, Rabbi? They died." Yeah, but we don't have the body. Or if they're sometimes with the autopsy, I don't know. You may be talking about that.
So listen, 100%. One of the saddest things that I think we do at Hebrew Free Burial Association, and one of the I think on the flip side, the holiest things we do, are people who have no next of kin. So in the city of New York, if you have no next of kin, you go to the medical examiner's office, and they for 2 weeks do a search to try to find a family member, and then you go into the public administrator's office, and the public administrator has at minimum 2 weeks, but often months, where they will be looking for next of kin. They don't really have a urgency that we would have on that. And I think a week and a half ago, we buried somebody who had been in the medical examiner's office since July. And like this is again what I love what I do, are reaching out regularly to the public administrator and saying, hey, can we give this person a proper burial? Hey, our big fear, I'll tell you, and we can talk more about this when we get to burial, is unidentified people at least in New York City. Each state is going to be different. We have an island in New York City that holds City Cemetery, and City Cemetery is a mass grave. So if you are unclaimed, unfortunately, in the city of New York, and no organization, whether it's us or the Muslims have a similar organization, or the Chinese have a similar organization, your body will unfortunately end up at City Cemetery in a mass grave, which is not ideal halakhically. It's also not ideal historically, with the history of our people in recent times. It evokes a lot of sadness and pain to think of Jews being just piled up in a mass grave. So we are very much cognizant of it.
Which is
and
the
we are
island? They just had an article about that. Which island is it?
It's called Potter's Field, but that's not Potter's Field. Is any mass grave site.
They
it's
just
usually
had
a
an
military
article about it because there were problems. They wanted to decorate the island or something.
And listen, we've a Hard Island. That's what it's called.
Hard, yeah. Okay.
And by the way, we had a case last year where we had a person who was in a nursing home, had no next of kin left, and had reached out to us beforehand and said, we want to be buried in at Mount Richmond Cemetery, at the Hebrew Free Burial Cemetery. And we set everything up. We did everything. The social worker who was on her case changed, and she ended up at the medical examiner's office, even though she had that request. She was buried in Potter's Field. No one had told us about it. She was buried at Hart. We then appealed to the state, and we disinterred her from Hart Island and gave her a proper burial at Mount Richmond. It's one of again, these are the proud moments I think I have for the work we do at my organization, is that we are dedicated beyond anything else to giving people proper Jewish burial, regardless of their background. Ron, I see you have your hand raised. Do you want to add something?
Well, actually, I had two things. One was from before. Isn't there a name for somebody, the one person who's actually making the arrangements for the funeral, not the whole family?
So I mean, there is like in the business we have like the person who's doing it. There's not really a term for it, but there's
I thought there
people.
was I may just be wrong. I thought there was the one person had a different name than the rest of the family.
No, I mean, it's just these are Crovium. Now, there's going to be a difference between, I mean, we can talk about that either now if we have time, or if we don't, we'll do it in the next session. Between some of the customs, whether or not you're the child of the decedent, of the
Okay.
person who died,
All right. The second
that
question.
will change.
The second
Yeah.
question was just what you were talking about. Isn't there some kind of a halachic rule about not disinterring and moving somebody after they're buried?
So there is and there isn't, right? Actually, we're going to talk about this. I think we're three parts just short of it. Yosef, this is our precedent here. Yosef's going to die in Mitzrayim in 3 weeks. Spoiler alert.
And so did Jake.
Yes, Jacob dies in Mitzrayim, but they actually take his body at the time of his death and bring it back to Machpelah, and bury him along his his parents, and his grandparents. With Yosef, he says, "We're not leaving yet, but when we do leave, take my body with you." And it kind of throws this all on its side, because it's very clear from the text he's embalmed like an Egyptian to have his bones preserved, and have his body preserved, and he for 400 years is in Mitzrayim, and when they leave at the end of the Makota, at the end of the plagues, they take his body with them, and they actually travel with him for 40 years. It's a long disinterment, and they put him in Shem, modern day Nablus. They put him in Shem, and that's where he's buried. It's actually a contentious point because it's a Palestinian city, a Zone A city, that has the shrine to Yosef. But their disinterment is something that is done. It typically we only do it. Right, it's actually a great lesson for Hanukkah, because that's why we light more candles. There's a principle in Jewish law says Ma'alim b'kodesh ve'ein moradin. You go up in holiness, you don't go down. So a person who is buried in a mass grave, we can disinter them to put them in a solo grave to give them that higher kavod. Right, a person who is buried in Mount Richmond Cemetery, in our Hebrew Free Burial Cemetery, can then be disinterred to be moved to Israel if they wanted to, because that's considered a higher honor. And we've had that case before where someone was buried in our cemetery because they had no money when they died, and their great grandchildren made aliyah and became very wealthy, and they said, "We're only giving money to this and this organization if they reinter my great grandmother," and they want that money. They speak to us, and they disinter the body. I can tell you from the business side of it, I don't think that it's so practical. I think a body that's been
I'll tell you, one of the cemeteries here, which will remain nameless, but it's the one where my dad is. So anybody can find out. They want. It was, I don't know how many years. A couple years after my dad passed away, they called my mom and said, "Can we move him over one grave?" Because I don't know, they wanted to extend the driveway or something, and my mom refused because you can't disinter a body.
Well, and I think that listen. I think that's a fair statement to refuse that. It's a you should know that when a body has already been put in a spot, it's not supposed to be used again. That spot is empty. I know some of you who were at my coffee and conversation when I was in town. I told you about Jabotinsky's grave, and how they moved his body. I was actually at that cemetery 3 weeks ago, where he was first buried. It's called New Montefiore. It's in Long Island. And I went to the spot of his grave because you can't put a new body in there. Once a space has been given to someone, even if they disinter, that space is supposed to lay useless. Like, you can't bury another person in that space. So it is discouraged within tradition. All right, let me go into some of the rules of Aninut because I think that those are actually very practical for people to learn, um, and I think it's very interesting. So the second that someone dies, right? This is in the Shulchan Aruch. If you have to reserve follow these rules if you're one of the Krovim, if you're one of the immediate family. You don't eat in your normal room. So if you eat in the kitchen, don't eat in the kitchen now. You're now in a different state. You're in this in between state. Right? And you're really supposed to try to change up your life as much as possible. What really gets me is you can block off your house, but then we get to here. You're not supposed to eat meat or drink wine. You're not supposed to say Birkat Hamazon. You're not supposed to say um, no one's supposed to say it for you. You're not supposed to put on tali and tefillin. I mean, I can get you through all of these. You're not supposed to do anything that enjoys you in Torah. No going to tefillah. You can't do anything in this space. You are supposed to be in a stuck space. How can you? And I think the justification is, how can you say a bracha that is blessing God in a time where you're in the most? It's the most difficult time, and you should have all these things beside them. You don't put on your tefillin because there's no your goal is not saying prayers right now. Your goal is getting your loved one a proper burial. That is the goal. And the only exception to that is if Shabbat comes in or a festival comes in, you are allowed to eat meat and drink wine and say brachot. So Shabbat can pause this aninut status. But other than that, once Shabbat ends, you're back to this aninut status. There is no getting back to normal until that burial happens, and it kind of works like a progression. This is your lowest point, and then Shiva is a little bit less low, and then Shloshim is a little bit less low, and then the full year is a little bit less low until you have to get back to getting back to your life. So you can see this is one law, but it really is. You shouldn't be sitting on a couch. This is the only exception. I mean, we're adults here to Shabbat rules is that you can't have marital relations. That's the only Shabbat thing that you can't do. That is listed on here. And by the way, it's so extreme about doing this in such a quick way that even though a Jew would not be able to do certain rules about opening up the grave and doing other things, if you wanted to have a non-Jew bury your loved one on the second day of the festival, which is kind of, is it Hag, is it not Hag? You can have it. Right? Think about it. The first day of Sukkot, nope, we're not going to do it. Second day of Sukkot, technically, according to the Shulchan Aruch, if a non-Jew were to dig the grave, because you can't dig the grave, you would be allowed. It'd be permissible to have that happen. We don't do that today. There's actually a tshuva by Reb Moshe Feinstein, who was a big rabbi in his time, that you don't you don't do that because people will be tempted to break Shabbat. Our cemeteries aren't usually in walking distance in our modern era, and if we were to have a second day of Chag funeral, people are going to drive there. And so he actually in America said we don't do that anymore. But you will find
in other words, you will wait. You can wait a Saturday, Sunday, Monday. Or you can wait 3 days. Like when you have Yantif on Thursday, Friday, and then there's Saturday, so you're waiting.
So then the burial will be Sunday.
Because we around here we have him on the second day of Yantif.
On second day of Yantif, you've had funerals. So
but it's It's sort of limited.
Right.
And I think at times they picked my husband up. He didn't drive. They picked him up.
Right. So most places here will say, if let's say it's a 3-day Yontif, Thursday, Friday, and then Shabbat, they won't do the burial on Friday. They'll do it on Sunday. That's typical for most places in America at this point. There are some groups who will, but you can see it is allowed within the halacha.
Because
All
you
right,
also
so
have the problem, the expense, because you can work, it can happen, for Memorial Day or some young Christian thing where they won't bury, and it starts getting very expensive. The
yeah, I
Orthodox will
listen,
pay it.
and we have to deal with that. I can tell you, from my institution, we have to deal with that. Again, we are working with the poorest of the poor, so there'll be times where the New York Marathon is happening through, and then no one's going to be able to drive to Staten Island on that day, and
Right.
it's going to cause it to be a much longer procedure. And we might say, it's close enough, we can actually push it off to the next day. We can do it on Monday as opposed to Sunday. Right? There is ability to extend it. It's when people try to extend it for a week or 2 weeks, or again, when we have a burial in November for someone who died in July. That to me, like the term I would use is really a busha. It's an embarrassment to the community at large. I don't know if to the Jewish community, we're fighting on the behalf of these people, but the idea that anybody has to wait that long is really sad. Major, I'm not talking about a murder case here or something like that. Although we've had murder cases too, and they still can be buried fairly quickly here too. All right, so let's start talking about what happens. So the body gets to us at the Hebrew Free Burial. We get to our Tahara facility, and modern facility. It goes in the fridge until our Chaver Kedisha can come. Typically, Chaver Kedisha are segregated by gender. So you will have a male Chaver Kedisha working with men, and a female Chaver Kedisha working with women. And that's done because you're going to have a body that's naked, and we want to show again as much kavod as possible. It's a respect issue. When the Chaver Kedisha is working, they will not talk. The only exception to that is if you have more than Chaver Kedisha than not, they might be saying psalms. One of them might be assigned to say psalms while everybody's working, but there is no conversation amongst everybody because this is a time of being respectful. The first thing that the Chaver Kedisha says, and you should know, Chaver Kedisha are by rule not really allowed to talk about what they do. It's supposed to be. It's not because it's supposed to be secretive or bad for death is supposed to be not talked about, but rather you don't want somebody knowing who saw your loved one in their last moments. It's a secret society because we want to give respect to that person and to those loved ones. And by the way, that happens on all sorts of things in our world. When I was on the ambulance, I used to work on an ambulance in Israel for a summer. And my trainer, who taught me how to be an ambulance worker, talked about doing a suicide bombing because he experienced it, he'd lived through it, and he talked about being at the table where people were talking about, can you believe that this person died? And he was the one who had done CPR on that woman, right? It's not for me to share that I was in that moment doing that CPR for that loved one, right? It's not for me to share what's going on in that world because it's disrespectful to that body. And the same idea, it's not for me if I'm in the Chaver Kedisha to share, oh yeah, I saw that person, right? Oh, how did they look? Did they look okay? Well, it's not. We want to keep this as private as possible. So they are very tight-lipped about what they do because they don't want to have the conversation about, well, did you do this person? Did you not do this person? They want to keep it private. And so they'll come in and they don't speak. The first thing they actually do is before they start doing their process, they'll say a kavanah. It's not really a bracha, but a focusing statement, asking for forgiveness. They might make a mistake in this whole process, and this person deserves dignity. So I want to start off by asking for forgiveness. They're actually going to ask for forgiveness beforehand, and when they finish off, they're going to ask for forgiveness again. Because no one's perfect. We could make a mistake. We could have not clipped someone's nails properly. We could have not washed a piece of material. You have to remember, in today's world, when people die, they often die coming out of a hospital, and they have adhesive all over them, and they might even have pieces of the plastic and things like that. And so the first thing they're going to do before they even do any of the ritual purification is make sure any adhesive, any injection points, any plastic pieces that are attached to their body have been removed, have been thrown away, and that's not going with them. That's not how they go to meet HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We want them to be met in the most pure form possible, and that's in a clean way. So we wash them, and then after they wash them, they actually there's a mikvah, and they put them in a mikvah. It's a different type of mikvah than maybe what you've seen if you've ever seen a traditional mikvah. There's usually almost a crane piece, so that way they can pick up the body and lower it down into the water, and then bring it back up, and then they start getting it dressed. So I'll start showing you. The dress is very, very plain. I'll see if I can move back a little bit here. It's a very plain dress. This is the undershirt, right? And I'll go through everything here. If you sorry, I'll stop sharing when I do that. That was on me. But let me get through. Let me show you some of this piece first. So it used to be people got really fancy tachrichin, really fancy tachrichin, and Rabban Gamliel did not like this idea, and this is the story. And he said, "Nope, dress me in my most simple clothing. That's not how we should die. We shouldn't show off how rich we are in our last moments. When we die, we're all equal. No money goes with you." And actually, Rabbi Plofkin, who is the person who is the chaplain at my cemetery, will often say to people, notice that tachrichin don't have pockets. There is nothing to hold your possessions, because you're not going with possessions. That's not where you go. You go with your soul, and that's what you go with. So let me start showing you some of the pieces here. All right, so we have the undershirt, right? Very plain, all linen, hand stitched. I mean, I can try to show you. It's a hand stitched piece. There's a string to put it on. So this is going to go on the body. Okay, then we have our pants. Again, very simple pants. The most noticeable thing about these pants is that there is no leg holes. It covers the seams are the bottoms are sewn on the bottom of the legs, right? Because you're not going anywhere. You're not doing anything at this point. So this is really to kind of tuck you in your gown here. So those
are there two legs or one leg like an angel?
Two. Right, traditional two. I believe for a woman it is a dress as opposed to a pants, but for the men there's a pants piece here. I haven't looked at the women's one, so I can't go for sure. Then you have your kittel, your overgown. Now, people wear kittels, right? Kittels are worn in Jewish tradition 3 times. They're supposed to be worn 3 times in your life, or in your life or post-life. When you get married, there's a tradition to wear a kittel, right? And it's very nice that women wear white. In the Christian world, for purity signs, we have a different idea of purity here going on, and we'll talk about that. In the Jewish tradition, white is also very pure color, but it's a color of transition. On the high holidays, people will wear their white kittels, and you'll see them walking around with the white kittels. And when you die, you wear white kittels. And the idea is that it's transitional.
I thought Pesach also.
Yes. Yes, Ron?
I thought you also wear a kittel for Pesach.
There are people who have that custom of wearing a kittel for Pesach. Again, transitional, right? This is a transitional idea. So when you wear your kittel for marriage, when a man wears a kittel, because that is a traditional thing, is that the man would wear a kittel too, and would wear white, as well as the bride wearing white. There's an idea that when you get married, you don't just make a combination of your finances and your social life and all these different things. Your souls are now bound together, and you're going into a new stage in your life. And I would argue that, like, minus the soul piece, you are transitioning your life. Your life will not be the same, even if the marriage doesn't end. It ends without like not amicably. Like if there's a divorce, your life will never be back to what it was like the first time you were single. I think that will be a different status. There's no going back from it. And then you have the high holidays. You're asking for, I'm going to be a new person in this new year. I'm going to change who I am. I'm going to be better. I'm going to be holier. I'm going to do better in the future. And that's that transition. My soul's being purified here and moved into the next part. Pesach, the transition is very clear if you have the custom on Pesach. You're going from being a slave to being free. You're going to have this new state. And when we die, we go from being in this world to being in the next world, right? To being bound up in the bounds of life. Like that's the statement that's usually put on the bottom, the different letters that are put on the bottom of the gravestone, right? We are now being put into this new state in Ha'olam Haba, in the world to come. So that's our gowns, except for there are two more pieces here. There is a blanket for underwards. I can show you. It's a big, long linen blanket. And that's used to be between you and the coffin, you and the Aron there, as a little bit of a divider. And then your face is actually covered. And so this is the face mask. It literally covers the face. And that was actually also for an embarrassment piece. You didn't want to make someone, often people's faces look a little bit different in that last moment of death. Sometimes it can be not a pleasant experience. And you don't want to have that face be what's seen. So you, out of modesty for them, out of respect for them, you cover their face. Now, there is also a custom that I think very few people actually know about, that before you put on the face mask, there is a shell. There is a clay pot, that the clay pots at the Taprichin facility, and those are broken. And one that is in the shape of your mouth is put over your mouth and over your eyes. Now, also they'll put the dirt, the soil from Israel, on that below, between the pottery and the body. So if you can imagine, they're right here and here. Even when you end up seeing a loved one, because sometimes they'll ask you to identify the body before burial, they will take off the pottery shards. But the pottery shards are another piece that it gets put into the burial custom. So that's really how you're put in this gown. You are done, again, all in silence, after being put in a mikveh, after they've said they're sorry for any mistakes they're going to make. They put you in the mikveh. They dress you in these garbs. They put you in your coffin to be ready for burial. And then they go and they say, we're sorry again. Because they really are doing this with the utmost honor and respect towards a person. Before I move on, I see Sheila has a question.
Yeah, what about the talus?
Great. So the talus is also often, and I actually didn't put that in my little source sheet here. There is a custom of putting a talit in. You should know that they cut off one of the corners of a talit if it isn't already unkosher. You don't bury things that are kosher into the ground. You bury things that have been pasul, had been made unkosher, right? So that's why shemot also, things that have God's name in it, also get buried, right? They're not things that are in good shape. There are things that they can't be repaired anymore, and so they will cut off a corner of one of the corners of the fringes, so it's no longer a kosher talit. They will put it around the body. So now you're going to talk about, they're in this outfit. They put that around there. Then they put the blanket below that. That's going to be the full piece there. It isn't part of the tafrichin, because usually the tradition is that you take a talus that is yours, if you have one, and that's what you would use. I'll tell you, over COVID, when we were bombarded at Hebrew Free Burial with burials, one of my colleagues put out a post on Facebook saying, anybody who has a talaisim that they need to get rid of, please send them forward. And we were blessed with thousands of talaisim that got shipped into the cemetery, because I think people just wanted to help, and that was an easy way for them to be able to help out. Yes.
Now, I thought that you took the body and you just wrapped it around the way the Muslims seem to do. You just wrap it around. Like in Israel, when they were doing Rabbi Schachter's funeral, he was taken, I think, was he taken out of the box? It was hard to tell. But probably he wasn't, because it was very clear. I saw Lifsa Schachter mouth that, am I going to be on top of him? And she confirmed it when I wrote to her. So that it was just, he was just wrapped around the way we
So
see the burials of the Muslims who
so I'll get to you, Ruth. I see your hand raised. I'm just going to respond, and then I'll get to you, Ruth.
would know.
So in Israel, with the exception of one type of cemetery, people are buried without coffins. Right? So in Israel, there is no coffin. Again, we'll touch on that with burial when we talk about green burial. I think that we are very much in line in our Jewish tradition with green burial. But yes, so when you see a burial in Israel, you're going to see it without a coffin. The only exceptions to the coffin rule are, is one, if a body is being transported from America to Israel, they'll have a coffin, they just won't use it, right? Because they have to ship the body in something, and so it will be shipped in a coffin. And at every military cemetery in Israel, they require coffins, and it actually has a lot to do with the tachrichin idea, right? We don't have fancy tachrichin. That doesn't exist because we don't want to embarrass someone who doesn't have the money for a fancy tachrichin. No one should be embarrassed to die. If someone is in battle, they're very often they could be damaged. Their body could be damaged in a way that is
Yeah.
painful. Like you could have lost limbs. You could be in a really bad state as a physical being. And we don't want to embarrass anybody in their burial to say, oh, this person died without an arm. Right? And so so for those people, because of that concept, at a military cemetery, they will bury in a coffin. So that's the exception to the rule in Israel. But in Israel, yeah, we've already talked about it. They're very quick to bury. Again, very similar to Muslim rites. Muslim rites are also very quick to bury, but in Israel, we're more strict about that. They'll bury within hours. Right. One of the things I think I've been most impressed by, when Ovadia Yosef passed away, which was like 10 years ago now, he died. He was buried within hours, and 750,000 people showed up for his funeral. It's an unthinkable number for me. Like the rally, for anybody who was at the rally in DC, like imagine that times 3, being coordinated within hours of someone's dying. They had to close down the city of Jerusalem, but they do that in rapid time, because that's how it's believed. That's how it's felt. And yeah, they're not done with a coffin. So I think I actually. Sheila, you're muted. I think you're muted.
The original question was, though, I always understood that they just wrapped the body without all the different. That was already the tarichim, tachritim, and I mean, you have a whole outfit that they have, and I always understood that you just wrap the body like in a sheet and buried it that way.
Right. So there definitely is I'm going to try to move this a little bit further back here so that way I can see. There definitely is a shroud, right? Like this is basically a big blanket here, a big linen blanket that is wrapped around the body. And in Israel, this is what you would see. But you would see this as the last thing. Under that is still the clothing, is still the shirt, is still the face mask. All those pieces are still there below it. You just wouldn't see it in the funeral because they would be wrapped in this. In Israel, they're going to do a tighter wrap because that's how the body's going to go down. You want it to be in that presentation. But all these other pieces, the pants, the undershirt, the kittel, they're all actually still there. Any other?
Why
any
so
other
much?
Question? What?
Why so
much?
Clothing? Yeah, I mean,
I think, doesn't all that clothing hinder the decay of the body? which is the purpose of burying it.
So I'm not sure in the grand scheme of things that it really does so much hindrance. These aren't pure linen garbs are not going to last so long in the dirt. They are going to be able to be consumed by the the microbes and things like that. Like, and these are natural wares. And I mean, well, I have it set up already for the burial piece to talk about um the coffin, but the coffin is also built in a way to allow things to break down. I actually assume that the coffin will take a lot longer to break down as a wooden piece than these thin materials. I can't show you the thinness of these, but they're not heavy materials here. They are very soft, um, very thin materials. Like they're made to break down. Right? It's not like my shirt here that is, I'm sure, a cotton blend that is very strong and it's made to be durable. That's not the goal there, right? That's been built the same way it's always been built, to be buried. Any other questions about the material? And by the way, you can even see, if I show it back on the shared screen, um, you can even see that even in the time, this is Rav Papa. He's talking about nowadays, when the 600s, everybody uses a plain hemp garment. That's what you're supposed to be using. That only cost a dinar. Very minimal cost. Because again, we want to show as much respect as possible. I didn't write about the shomer. Shomers can be costly. Shomers can also be a great way of showing kavod, showing honor to someone else. A shomer is someone who has said, I'm not going to let this body sit alone while we're waiting. And so there is a custom to hire someone to sit with the body, and ensure that the body is being taken care of. So yeah, a shomer will be there. If you hire a shomer, will probably be with the body from the time the funeral director drops off the body at the facility, wherever that is, where like the funeral home or the Tahara facility or wherever you are, and we'll sit outside of the Tachrichin room and we'll say the Psalms. They don't actually need to be there at the time of Tachrichin because you have the Chevra Kadisha there, but they will be waiting with the body to make sure that they are watched. And so usually that's really going to be that time from dropping off the body to actual to the Tachrichin, because from the Tachrichin, it's really short order from that time till the burial. It isn't the Vod of Queens who gives us rabbinic supervision for our organization, which is an Orthodox institution, does not require shomerim for our facility. But we do have the cases where people ask for a shomer, and we will uphold that request. I mean, it will be at their cost, and so sometimes if it's like over Shabbat, it's not always the easiest to do, and it can add cost. Sheila, I see your hands raised.
Yeah, first of all, I think that here they require the shomer, but
Okay.
I also think that the shomer was to protect against robberies and things like that. Because I remember, what was it, in the 80s, where people were literally taking the gold out of the teeth. I mean, it's a horrible thing to say, especially since it's my mother's yahrzeit next week, but they took the gold from her teeth and they gave it to me because otherwise it would have been stolen at that time.
Right. Also, like if there are things that can be taken out. Now, I'm not saying gold teeth, but let's say there's an earring on the body or things like that. They'll also take out the earrings and take out the jewelry, and then we will give it back to the family. I can think of a time where someone had an amulet because they someone gave an amulet to try to make them heal, and they were wearing that on their neck. We gave it back to the family and said, this was left on your loved one's body, and we want to give it back to you so you can keep it. Because yeah, you're not buried with those other pieces. I will say, the thing that you can be buried with, and actually it's elsewhere. They talk about it actually 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago in Daf Yomi. They talked about it. It's actually a blessing. It's actually an honor to be buried with Shemot. So if there are Sidurim that are damaged, if there's, I mean, the highest honor is if there's a Sefer Torah that's damaged, right? Like, that can and should be buried with someone who is of that dignity to be buried with the Torah. And that use the Torah a lot in their life. It is actually an honor to be buried with Shemot. We often don't do it together, because families don't know that, and they become uncomfortable with the idea of these papers coming in and being buried at their loved one's grave. But it's actually a form of respect to say the holy words of our tradition get buried with you.
Do they get
That you
buried
are
in?
together.
Do they get buried in the coffin?
So they certainly can be. They can also be put in on the ground where the burial is going to happen, like in the earth below. Again,
Because it
I
would
can show
save
you
an
some of
awful
those
lot of
sources.
money when we have the Shemot at this synagogue. We have to use a grave.
Yeah. And often, listen, people will give us Shemot too, and so what we often will do to make people not upset by the fact that we're bearing Shemot, even though again it's an honor,
Mm-hmm.
is we will probably we'll dig a 10-foot hole, put Shemot in, then recover the Shemot, and there'll still be plenty of space for the body below it, so that way we don't upset the family. But it is an honor to be buried with Shemot, um, because um, we're people of the book, and so this is our holy text, and these are our holy words, and so it's an honor to be buried with our holy words, right? We just like and if another religion has an idol, it would be a blessing to be buried with that idol. Our religious artifact is the word. That's what it's a blessing to be buried with. Um,
Today we could say
so
it's ecology. It's good for the ecology, and that would please some people more than saying that it's an honor to be buried with Shemot.
right. I
People
mean,
are
and we
that
can
way.
talk about, like, again, we'll talk about green burial and pieces like that. Yeah, the idea is that that you are brought into it. And by the way, even your coffin, the term for coffin in Hebrew is an aron, right? There are two things I can think of that really go in the aron: a Torah and a person, because they both contain kedusha. They are extremely holy. And so when we use when a person is ready to be buried, we put them in their aron. We put them in their holy place, just like we put away the Torah when we're done reading the Torah. We put it in a holy place. It's cared for. Um, it's done in a respectful way. Again, we'll talk about next time about the moving of the coffin. We'll also talk about. I'll show you a coffin showroom online, and you guys can see the different coffins that are all within halacha. But then we can go back and talk about our Tachrikin comparison. What are we supposed to be doing with our coffins, even if you're allowed to do a lot more? Um, so with that, these are really the processes from the time that someone has died until they are buried. The last thing that's going to happen is right before that funeral begins, right before we're in this burial piece, is you're going to have Kriya. And I can just briefly mention, and we'll start over on this too. It's always good to scaffold it in and start over again. Kriya is this tearing of the clothing you're wearing. And yet there's the ribbons, and we'll talk about that next time. Ribbons versus tearing of actual material. And for every mourner, except for a mourner for their parents, except for a child mourning their mother or father, the tear is on the right hand side but for your mother, your father, it's on the left hand because it's considered like your heart is being torn when your mother or father. Kriya. That's before I want to give you time for questions, but we're going to talk about that next piece next week. Does anybody have any questions before we finish up here?
Well, my hand's up, but
Yeah.
the question is, or maybe it's a statement, I don't know. I thought that Kriya, I know today we do Kriya just before the funeral ceremony, but I thought you're supposed to do it. I thought the real thing was to do it as soon as you hear of the death.
Ron, you're 100% correct. In antiquity, they did it at the moment they heard about it. I actually think that though it's changed more because of the world we live in. If you were living in Bavel, in Babylonia, in the time of the Talmud, and your teacher who lived in Eretz Israel, you found out they died, they probably have died, have been buried, Shiva's already ended, and if you're lucky, Shloshim has already started. Is still going on. It took a long time for news to travel in the same way it does now. I think that, and I don't know it for sure, but as time has moved forward, as we've been able to say, oh, someone died in Israel, I can get to that burial. I'll just get on a plane tonight and I'll be able to get there tomorrow. Which still would be a challenge with how fast they do burial in Israel. But it's a possibility. Our idea of doing Kriya has changed over time because of that, because it's more possible to be there in that moment. But Kriya, you're right, 100%. Originally, it was done at the time you heard about it, and originally Kriya was done for all sorts of things. You guys live 2 hours away from Pittsburgh. I was actually, when I was looking at these sources, I was struck by one of them that said, when a Torah burns, you do Kriya. That if you heard if a Torah has been burnt, you should be ripping your garments to say it, just like a dead body. Again, this Aaron connection that we're talking about here, and it reminded me of when the Beshalom fire happened. Like, I guess that was probably over 20 years ago now, and they ran in to save the Torahs, right, in the midst of a major fire, because we have this idea of kavod for a Torah. But yes, if you heard a calamity of like that sort, you did Kriya. If you heard of a great rabbi dying, even if you weren't related to him, you did Kriya. Kriya was a much more common thing to do, this tearing. And it was done at the time you heard about something, not necessarily at the time that burial happened. And I think that probably it happens to be about the idea that Kriya, you might hear about something after the actions, well after it's happened in the ancient world. Okay. Well, I want to thank everybody for coming out tonight, for hearing my spiel about Chevra Kadisha. It's a holy job. I give endless credit to anybody who does it, and to the work that is preparing a body with tachrichin and mikvah. And we'll continue next time with the rules of burial and the customs associated with it.
Thank you, Rabbi Reis. I'll just mention next week, Rabbi Reis, the class will be meeting, and then we actually have a couple weeks off over the end of December, and the final session will be on January 4th. But thank you, and happy Hanukkah to everyone.
Yeah, happy Hanukkah. Have a great night.